Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Michelson from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We're going to give it a minute more for people to join on the line. And until then, just sit tight. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to talk through our Policy Priorities webinar in anticipation of our national forum in a few weeks. My name is Elaine Weiss. I am the Senior Policy Analyst here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'm joined here with my colleague, Sarah Michelson, who is the Senior Policy Director here at the Coalition as well. So, next slide. If we're not sure if we said that already. We're having a few technical issues here, so please bear with us. And as a reminder, we will be recording this webinar, so if you have any questions at the end, or if you want to go back and re-listen to it, there will be a recording available for you. Great, so next slide. So first off, I want to just say thank you so much for joining us at our forum. We're really excited for you to come. We have some really great information and panels that we've organized this year. So we're super stoked to have you all here join us in DC to learn more about affordable housing issues. So,
and this is a prime time for our lobby day. Things are really cooking on the Hill right now. It's an incredibly busy time, but this is really the best time for advocates to be getting out there and meeting with their members of Congress to talk about housing issues.
Yes, so the halls are all busy right now. There's a lot of activity. So, you know, we want to make sure that you are prepared for our lobby day when you come to DC. So on lobby day, we will provide you with a lobby day packet and leave behind folders for each congressional meeting. And within each packet, you will have a toolkit with our policy priorities and talking points on each topic, and we're going to talk through some of those today. Fact sheets and a budget chart, which are really helpful, and you can leave those behind as well with those offices that you're visiting. Our new gap report that was just out today, go check it out if you haven't already done so. Our updated state and congressional district data profiles on local housing needs. I know that we've been waiting for those to be updated, so we're very excited that those are finally available. A map of Capitol Hill. We don't want you to get lost. But if you do, many people are very friendly. You can always ask. And then some other helpful resources.
So essentially, you'll have all the tools with you to make sure that you have a really effective meeting. If there's something else that you guys need, just let us know. Reach out. And also, we just want to let you know that these are our priorities, but you should feel free to focus on whatever issues are most important to you and your state and district. These are just our suggestions of what we're focused on, but you should feel free in different meetings to focus on different things and to highlight how these programs are useful to you in your district.
All right, so next slide. So here are urgent priorities that we are focusing on in the next few months. Number one, budget negotiations. As many of you know, that there are these low spending caps right now on federal spending that really tie the hands of Congress in providing adequate funding to the programs that we really care about. So we are urging that Congress lift those low spending caps and provide the highest funding possible for affordable housing and community development programs.
And we'll go into all of these in a little bit more detail in the following slides, but just to give you a sense, our second priority is to make sure that the Housing Trust Fund is expanded in GSE reform. We know that this is always a topic of conversation that we've had in the last several years, but we expect now Chairwoman Waters and Chairman Crapo and the Senate Banking Committee are going to continue to push forward with their GSE reform plans. We want to make sure that the Housing Trust Fund is a really key part of that. And then finally,
yes, there's been a lot of talk in Congress around coming together, bipartisan infrastructure package. They're talking a lot about dollars for highways and bridges and things like that. We want to make sure that housing is very much a part of that conversation, and ultimately that funding is included in any infrastructure package for affordable housing.
Great.
Next slide.
So we'll dig into each of those topics in a little bit more detail, and happy to answer any questions that you might have about it.
So protecting housing investments, spending bills for fiscal year 20. So what we're asking right now is to reject the president's budget proposal and to provide the highest funding possible for HUD and rural housing. As many of you saw last week, or no, it was this week. I'm losing track of the days.
Time is a flat circle.
That's how busy it is here in DC. We're losing track of the days. But as many of you saw this week on Monday, the president released his budget proposal for fiscal year 20 that included really ridiculous cuts to affordable housing. We're talking about an 18% cut to HUD programs, which would be absolutely devastating to those programs and more importantly to the people who rely on those programs. The proposal would, zero out public housing capital fund, underfund vouchers, project-based housing. If there was a program, you name it, it was probably underfunded. The only program that really saw an increase was around, I think, lead, healthy housing. And very much like last year, it included the president's proposal to increase rents on low-income residents, impose work requirements, all things that we know would be really harmful and wouldn't actually help people become self-sufficient.
Yeah, and so while it's really normally the case that the president's budget is considered dead on arrival in Congress, we want to use this opportunity to talk to members of Congress to reiterate why those cuts are so harmful in the context of making the argument for increased resources. So it's really important that members of Congress know that the president's budget is not the direction we need to go in, but then looking forward to 2020 and what Congress can do, they can lift the spending caps that are in place and provide the highest level of funding possible for HUD and USDA. And you might remember that these low spending caps have been in place since 2011. Every couple of years, we've seen Congress come to a bipartisan agreement to provide temporary or limited relief from those budget caps. And last year, in FY18, when this last happened, advocates were in a good position, along with our congressional champions, to secure a 10% increase in HUD programs. That was a really historic one-year gain, especially in comparison to what the president had proposed, which was at that time was a 15% cut. It really shows the power of your advocacy. And now is the time, now that those spending caps are coming back into place, it's the time for advocates like you and us to be on the Hill demanding the highest level of funding possible for HUD and USDA. In particular, we're asking for an additional $5 billion, $4 billion of which would be for increased funding for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and an additional $1 billion on top of the normal allocation for public housing repairs. We think that this is a really key moment to achieve this. Again, in the past, when Congress reached these bipartisan agreements, they had earmarked dollars for certain high priority areas. We want to make sure that housing is on the highest priority level for Congress in this budget agreement.
So next slide. So what you will be having in your leave behind packet is our handy dandy budget chart that has the funding levels from last year as well as the president's budget request. And I don't anticipate that either the House or Senate will have their numbers out. So that's what you'll have to look at while doing your visits. And then we're hoping that by the time you get here, we'll have those funding request levels for fiscal year 20 for the different programs. Next slide.
Great. As part of that, this sort of goes into the conversation about budget negotiations, which Elaine had spoken to earlier, but we want to make sure that Congress clearly rejects the president's call to cut housing benefits through rent increases or work requirements. We were lucky enough, or through your advocacy, we were able to see Congress reject similar proposals in past years. It's really important that we continue to push back on the narrative that these are realistic or real solutions to poverty. We know they are not, and in fact, they leave people more unstably housed, which could drive people into even deeper poverty. So we want that to be also a clear message when we're talking about the budget negotiations. And to that end, we'll have fact sheets on how rent increases and work requirements, how they contribute to increased homelessness and housing poverty, so that you are well equipped to push back on any narratives that your members of Congress might be using.
Next slide.
Next, our second ask for Congress is to include an expansion of the Housing Trust Fund in any housing reform legislation as part of a broader commitment to access and affordability. This is legislation that would reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which currently have a small assessment put on them that funds the Housing Trust Fund. There's been lots of bipartisan proposals in the past, and nearly all of them have recognized the important role of the Housing Trust Fund, even if they had disagreed on specific funding levels. The high water mark was the dollar amount that was included in the Senate Johnson-Crapo bill in 2014. We want to make sure that that is the starting point for negotiations about housing finance resources, but that we go well beyond that to also protect duty to serve and enforceable affordable housing goals and other measures to make sure that there's broad access to affordability throughout the housing market. To that end, we'll have fact sheets about how the Housing Trust Fund has been used so far and about how the program works overall.
All right. So our next ask is to Congress is ensuring that any infrastructure package include $15 billion for housing repairs, for public housing repairs, and $5 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund. As I said previously, there's been a lot of talk the last few years around Congress doing a big infrastructure package. It was just announced that the Democrats have reserved a high number bill, H.R. 2, to be potentially an infrastructure package. So we definitely want to make sure that housing is included in that package, and we need to continue to talk about housing as infrastructure. So we hope that when you go on your Hill meetings that you talk about this to your members, to their staffers. So to that end, we include a fact sheet on housing and infrastructure, really making the case for why people should be thinking about housing as infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. And this perhaps is one of, beyond the budget negotiations, this would be one of the primary ways that we can see an expansion of housing resources this year in Congress. The appropriations process always has some limitations on how much we can get each year because of other funding priorities that are in play. An infrastructure package could really potentially be a place where we could see a significant expansion of housing resources this year. So we hope that you include that in your conversation with your members of Congress.
Next slide.
So next, beyond these three legislative vehicles, there are a number of bills that NLIHC has been endorsing, and we'd love for you to encourage you to reach out to your members of Congress to ask them to co-sponsor this year. So we wanted to go through a couple of these to give you a sense of what it is that we're prioritizing in case those are ones that you want to raise in your meetings as well. The first are a series of bills that are around expanding investments in affordable rental homes. Top of that list is the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act. This was reintroduced by Senator Warren and Representative Richmond yesterday. It would include a really substantial, robust investment in the National Housing Trust Fund of $445 billion over 10 years. I'll say that again, $445 billion. It also includes investments in the Capital Magnet Fund, in rural and tribal housing needs, provisions to expand the Fair Housing Act protections to include source of income discrimination or discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, veteran status, marital status. It's a really expansive bill, and we'll include a fact sheet on it in your lobby day packets as well. But we're also supporting a number of other bills that we'd love for you to raise. One is the Ending Homelessness Act from Representative Waters, or Chairwoman Waters. It would provide about $13 billion in housing resources, including vouchers and money for the National Housing Trust Fund. Next, we're supportive of a task force bill that was introduced by Senator Young last year. It calls for the creation of a bipartisan task force that would look into the affordable housing crisis and put forward recommendations to Congress on how to address those problems. And then, of course, the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Improvement Act from Senator Cantwell. Last year, it was co-sponsored by Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah. He has since retired. We expect this bill to be reintroduced in the week or so after our conference, but this is a good opportunity to get in front of your members of Congress about supporting the bill. It would expand the low-income housing tax credit by 50%, but it also includes much-needed reforms to help to facilitate more development for extremely low-income and formerly homeless households.
Next slide.
Great.
Okay. The next bills that we're going to talk about really try to bridge the gap between incomes and housing costs. So, Sarah, if you want to talk about what the Rent Relief Act and the Housing Opportunity, Mobility, and Equity, the HOME Act, would do, that would be great.
Yeah. So both of these bills have been introduced by 2020 candidates. Senator Harris introduced the Rent Relief Act, and Senator Booker has led on the HOME Act. Both of them would create really innovative, new, refundable tax credits for renters that would make up the difference between what they can afford to pay in rent and what their rent is, capped at a reasonable amount. Both of these are taking really clever, innovative approaches to how we can provide essentially rental assistance, but on the tax side of the equation. I think there's a lot of interest in this from members of Congress. We certainly think it's a really creative way of getting resources to the lowest income people outside of the appropriations process, because we know how difficult those challenges have been. So both of these bills are ones that we think are worthy of you bringing up with your members of Congress and encouraging them to co-sponsor. We'll likely see the Harris bill reintroduced in the coming weeks and shortly after the Booker bill.
Great. Next slide. All right, so the next couple bills address fair housing and equity. So the one bill, the Fair Housing Improvement Act by Senator Kaine, would expand the number of protected classes under the Fair Housing Act to include veteran status and gender identity and sexual orientation. The Fair and Equal Housing Act, Sarah, is that the same bill?
No, I think the first one is about veteran status and source of income discrimination. The second bill is about sexual orientation and gender identity. Okay,
sorry for the confusion there. And then the Restoring Fair Housing Protections Eliminated by HUD Act, Chairwoman Waters introduced that act to really address some of the recent actions by this current administration in undermining fair housing through their suspension of certain rules and regulations at HUD. The Fair Chance at Housing Act, also introduced by Representative Waters, looks to reform the way that owners of federally assisted housing screen and evict people based on their criminal records, making sure that people who have criminal records actually have a fair shot at getting into federally assisted housing. And then the Tenant Protection Act would help folks who have evictions on their record. It would disallow certain records for being on people's screening reports. If you did not actually get evicted, it was just filed and nothing ended up happening, that wouldn't be allowed to be on your record. And then if you were evicted, that would only be allowed to be on your record for 3 years. It would roll off. So it's trying to help people. We know that once some once your landlord brings you to court, you end up being on this blacklist, and it really hampers your ability to get into housing after.
Great.
Yep, next slide.
And the last set of bills are ones that would help ensure a complete and equitable disaster recovery. This is an issue that NLIHC has been working on for the last 2 years since we started the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. We've seen after Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, the California wildfires, Hurricane Florence, and Michael, continuous, repeated failures with FEMA at addressing the housing needs, especially of the lowest income people. And so we've been working with Wagner and Green's office on the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act. This is a bill that would formally authorize a long-term disaster recovery program that's used in communities to rebuild housing after a disaster. And we're also supporting the Housing Victims of Major Disasters Act from Senator Warren and Representative Espaillat that would provide rental assistance to survivors who have been displaced after disaster. The Titus bill that we include here is very similar to that bill. We support both of them, even though they take slightly different approaches.
All right, next slide. So that concludes our policy agenda, at least for the conference. So if anybody has any questions, we're happy to answer them. If not now, you could always reach out to us after, which is our contact information on the next slide.
Any questions?
Hi, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom. I've got the questions box here. So the first question that comes through is about bill numbers. Josephine is wondering, do we have bill numbers for the various pieces of legislation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For nearly all of these bills, there are not bill numbers yet. And the reason for that is because these bills while they were introduced last term, at the start of a new Congress, members of Congress have to reintroduce their bills, and many of them haven't been reintroduced just yet. We still wanted to make sure that we put these bills on your radar and on the radar of members of Congress. So even though there aren't bill numbers, we still think it's important for you to raise them. And we didn't want to include bill numbers from last year because they aren't really being used this go-around. Hopefully that answers your question, Josephine.
Thank you. So we also have, you said the infrastructure bill from the Democrats was H.R. 2, but you also said we should advocate for a certain amount of funding for public housing repairs in the National Housing Trust Fund. Is that money not currently included in the bill language?
So there isn't currently bill language yet. Members of Congress are working really feverishly to put together an infrastructure package, and we're not quite sure what that will include. We just want to make sure that when it is introduced and bill language is provided, that there are resources for housing, particularly to build housing for the lowest income people. And through this effort, we've been calling for $15 billion in repair to help repair public housing, and $5 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund.
The bill will be H.R. 2. They reserved it for whatever legislation they come up with.
Right.
And because it's H.R. 2, it just shows that it's a very high priority for them.
Got it. All right, next question we have is there anything we should be saying about opportunity zones during our lobby meetings?
Well, you should always feel free to bring up whatever issues you want to focus on. For now, that's not one of our most urgent asks for Congress, but you should feel free to bring that up.
Okay, great. And let's see what else we have here.
And I'll say the reason why we picked these three as our top most urgent priorities is because these are the legislative opportunities that we see as most likely in this Congress.
Great. I have one more question, and it's kind of a details question. Can you elaborate on how the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act supports tribal housing needs?
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I had specific dollar amounts in front of me, but I know the bill includes additional block grant money, NAHASA block grant money. It also includes resources for Native Hawaiians as well. So these are funding levels through the standard HUD programs.
And the amount for that funding is on the fact sheet. So if you're curious, you could find it there.
All right, so this is kind of the last call for questions. Anyone, please feel free to enter questions into the questions box on the right-hand side of the screen. So I just got a question from Eric Huffnagel in Michigan. Are you able to provide any guidance with respect to congressional targets based on their committee assignments? The answer to that, Eric, is yes. We can specifically highlight particular members of Congress based on their committee assignments. And one of the things that we're doing on the field team is trying to get a sense of who is all participating in Lobby Day. And that way, once we know who's going to participate and where they're from, we can identify the key members. So for a group like yours, knowing that you're from a statewide organization, we can just take a look at who's particularly important in Michigan and flag that for you as you're going about scheduling your meetings.
Yeah, and I'll just generally say most of the work that we're talking about in this context would be going through either the House Financial Services Committee or the Senate Banking Committee, and so or the Appropriations Committees. So if you have members that are on either of those committees, those might be the ones that you want to prioritize. But again, you should feel free to reach out to the field team or us on the policy team about figuring out who makes the most sense to hit in your limited time that you're here.
Yeah, so I don't have any more questions unless anybody wants to. Oh, here's another one. All right, so I've got a question from Jennifer, who points out that almost 20% of the U.S. is rural, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of literature on addressing those areas. How can we bridge that gap in order to include those populations as well? Yeah,
absolutely. We have certainly been advocating when it comes to increased resources for housing through the budget negotiations to make sure that it's not just HUD's budget that sees the highest level of funding possible, but also USDA rural housing. Elaine didn't mention it, but in addition to the many HUD programs that were eliminated, nearly all of the rural housing programs were also proposed to be eliminated under the president's budget. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen as well. The information about funding levels for rural housing programs will also be included in our budget chart, so you'll have that available to you as you engage with your members of Congress.
I got another question here. It's about scheduling lobby meetings, and this one I can answer. During last week's webinar, we were saying that about 2 weeks out is the best time to schedule lobby meetings. And so we're in that window right now, and it sounds like maybe there was a comment made today that people could schedule meetings even during the policy forum, which is possible to be sure. Definitely seen some of that happen. The truth, though, is right now what we're finalizing is just figuring out for everybody who's attending the event who is and is not participating in Lobby Day. Because what this helps us do is, for example, we have 8 people coming from Michigan, and we wouldn't want 8 individual people trying to set up a meeting with Senator Stabenow's office. And so to avoid that, we try to get a sense of who's coming from where, and then if it makes sense to have one state captain for a state schedule all the meetings, then we ask a person to do that, and we kind of connect everybody from a state to one another. In some states, there might only be 2 or 3 people attending, and we ask people to set up their own meetings. The reason we don't set up the meetings ourselves here at NLIHC is we found that advocates get to meet with higher level staff people when the request comes from an actual constituent, more so than when it comes from a DC-based organization. So if anyone has questions about who should be scheduling their meetings, please get in touch with myself or Brooke or Tori or Kyle on the field team, and we can connect with you about getting that done right away.
And I'll just add on to that if you don't have contact information for the staffer in these offices, again, that's a resource that the field team, the policy team can provide to you. And as Joey mentioned, while you always can go to your office the day of the lobby day, it's better to try to plan something in advance. That way you can make sure that the staffer is on hand who works on this issue can meet with you. Otherwise, you run the risk that maybe you are sitting with an intern who isn't familiar with housing at all. So to make sure that you're getting in front of the right person, it's always better to try to meet, set these meetings up a little bit in advance.
So we have another question. This is from Troy in Michigan, who says that while reading the GAP report today, It says there's 7.2 million shortage of affordable and available homes. Quickly, I'll just say, Troy, well done reading it this morning on the news review. While Senator Warren's bill would cover about half of that, half of the 7.2 million shortage, where would we find other funding for the 3 million that still need to be housed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you'll see that both the Harris and Booker and Warren bills don't purport to be the only solutions to the affordable housing crisis, but they certainly are key pieces of it. So for Senator Warren, she took the approach of wanting to invest in constructing new units, and that's really important and helpful. We support that bill. But of course, and there are many communities in which there is adequate supply, but the supply is not affordable for the people who live there and for the lowest income people who live in those communities. And so something like a renter's tax credit or expanded vouchers is really the solution that's needed there. And so at the end of the day, if pieces of the Warren bill and the Harris and Booker bill and other bills come together to get enacted, I think that's a great outcome that we could hope for. But again, none of these bills are aiming to be the end-all, be-all of all the solutions that are out there.
Okay. All right, any other questions? All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. We will follow up on this webinar with all of the materials that were mentioned so that you can read those materials in advance. If you have questions as you're reading, feel free to get in touch with Sarah or Elaine, whose contact information will be on the next slide, or any of us on the field team who have been reaching out to you about your Lobby Day participation over the last couple of weeks. Sarah?
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much.
Bye.